take it from there?
Yes. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to the jointly sponsored Real World AI series hosted by Health AI Partnership and AIM High based at Kaiser Permanente. We are very excited to host speakers from UC San Diego as well as a discussant from Metro Health. And my co-host is a sepsis expert in his own right. So hopefully we have a invigorating discussion, and thank you everyone for making time to join us today.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So I'm Vinny Liu. I'm at Kaiser Permanente, and I'm the principal investigator for the AIM High initiative, where we're doing randomized evaluations of 5 different real-world AI applications. And we are also co-hosting this symposium where we're looking at algorithms and deployment in real-world settings. And it's a really, really great pleasure to invite friends here who are going to be presenting on the work that they've been doing in sepsis AI. So I will first introduce Dr. Shamim Nemati, who's currently the Director of Predictive Health Analytics at UC San Diego Health, an Associate Professor of Biomedical Informatics, also at UCSD, where he leads an NIH-funded critical care informatics research group with work that focuses on large-scale multimodal data from EHRs and wearable sensors paired with cutting-edge machine learning to improve patient experience and outcomes across the continuum of care. He's also joined by Dr. Gabriel Wardi, who is an ED-trained intensivist, medical director of hospital sepsis at UCSD, and associate professor there, where he holds a joint appointment in pulmonary critical care and emergency medicine with a research focus of improving outcomes of patients with sepsis and septic shock, with a major emphasis on the development and implementation of novel deep learning approaches to identify and personalize care for these patients. And then finally, our discussant is Dr. Yasir Tarabici, who is a board-certified informaticist, pulmonologist, and intensivist dedicated to advancing the responsible implementation of AI in health systems. He serves as the CMIO of Ovation, an entrepreneurial virtual care collaborative launched by Metro Health and the Medical University of South Carolina. And he's led multiple initiatives focusing on the integration of data analytics and AI to improve clinical decision making and operational efficiency. This is a really, really great group that's not only doing cutting edge science, but understands the challenges of real world implementation and evaluation. So it's going to be a real treat. So with that, I think I'm turning it over to Dr. Nemati to get us kicked off.
Well, thank you
Really?
so much for the invitation. I think Dr. Wardi is going to get us
Oh,
started.
okay,
Yes.
perfect.
Gabe, go ahead.
Perfect. I just want to make sure that everyone, let's see, let's get this here. All right. Can everyone see my slides appropriately? One second. There we go.
Yep,
Just a
we're
thumb.
looking good.
All right, perfect. So first of all, thank you for the invitation here. This is something that Shamim and we first met in 2019 and have been collaborating together. And this is actually something that we've been very, very excited about, some of the the collaborative endeavors that we've had. In terms of disclosures, we're both funded by the NIH. And I have served on an advisory board for Abbott Laboratories. Dr. Nemati is also a co-founder of a startup formed in accordance with UCSD policies. And I don't think I have to tell this group why sepsis is so important. It remains one of the most common and costly conditions treated in the United States and worldwide. It's estimated over 50 million people a year develop sepsis, of which about 10 million people die. We also know that in the United States, sepsis is probably the most expensive single medical condition, with estimated costs exceeding about $50–60 billion a year. We also know that one of the appeals of using any kind of machine learning process to identify sepsis early is very, very intuitive, but also been something that many groups have been trying to do well. Although there is much debate over the optimal treatment of sepsis patients once identified, everyone agrees that early detection and prompt antibiotics make sense. And then finally, if you are interested more on the financial side, We have seen that the SEP1 quality metric is now part of the hospital-based value purchasing program, which means that institutions have that much more of an emphasis on trying to make sure that care is done ideal for these patients. Now, the article we're going to talk about today was published in January of 2024. It's called Impact of a Deep Learning Sepsis Predictive Model on Quality of Care and Survival. You can see some people here that you probably names you recognize, like Dr. Christopher Longhurst, who is actually the one that brought Shamim and I together. But it really was a multidisciplinary effort across data scientists like Shamim, clinicians like myself, and also some of our nurses about really making sure we could bring something to the bedside that would improve patient-centered outcomes. And I think the other thing that I want to emphasize here is that this hasn't just been a single kind of one-off. We're going to go over some of the preceding literature, like you can see here, which is a description of the actual one or an early model of what we use clinically now at UC San Diego, to the model that we're going to discuss today and how that impacted patient-centered outcomes. And then also moving forward, how we've continued to update this using large language models in a publication in Nature Digital Medicine earlier this month. And I think one thing, just to emphasize here is that there have been, for those of you that do not follow sepsis care, there have been probably about 180 or so different therapies that have been proposed as novel strategies to improve care for sepsis patients. They've gone through studies and all of them have failed. And I think that's what got Shamim and I so excited once we saw some positive results from the work that we've done together. Now, I think one thing also to mention, right, is that since this is an informatics discussion, right, I can't do this without mentioning the EPIC sepsis score. This is our chief AI officer at UCSD who, got a lot of attention when he highlighted, some of the, or at least at the University of Michigan, when they externally validated the EPIC sepsis score, that it didn't perform as well as it reported. And there was a lot of false positives. Sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value were significantly lower than what was reported. Now, that being said, perhaps the biggest paper showing the benefit of the EPIC sepsis score comes from our discussant at Metro Health, who actually did a very elegant study in the emergency department using the EPIC sepsis model, where alerts went to pharmacists, and not only were they able to show that they had a shorter time to antibiotics, but there was also some secondary outcomes suggesting a benefit. And I think this is where, again, one of the big differences of what we've done here is that we used a homegrown model that Dr. Nemati built over many, many years. So I think I don't have to emphasize this too much to the group here. Deep learning in sepsis, I think, is something for that early prediction. It makes a lot of sense, right? Sepsis is an incredibly complex condition, and it's something that nonlinear modeling makes a great idea or a great concept for approaching these. We can also take advantage of a lot of the data streams that are coming in here. And as I showed you earlier, we're really starting to take advantage now of clinical notes by using large language models, and we'll talk about more of that. So I think really, at least the experience we've had here is that deep learning gives us a fantastic opportunity to see if we can predict sepsis before it happens and see how that can impact care. So what we want to show right here is this is from our paper that was published in 2021 called An AI Model Learns to Say, I Don't Know. And what we're emphasizing here is that one of the common concerns that a lot of providers have with sepsis models is there's a lot of false positives. And this is what Dr. Karandeep Singh highlighted with his work at the University of Michigan. And so the strategy that we took here is to use something called conformal prediction. And the way to think about this, and conceptually, is that what this represents is that if the model sees something that it has not yet had or at least it hasn't been trained on, if there's a patient encounter where their data is not meeting something that it thinks that it can make a fair prediction on, it effectively says, I don't know, that alert will be silenced. And I think, when we talk about how that actually improves things, you can see some of the data that we have right here for the model that we use called Composer. And just showing you guys, how this actually impacted both the AUC of the model. When we ran this is retrospective data from 500,000 patients. The AUC at both University of California, San Diego, as well as Emory University was exceptionally high at about 0.95. But more excitingly, what we're able to show is that the number of false alarms per patient per hour with the model that we use compared to the Epic sepsis model as well as a feed-forward neural network were significantly decreased. And I think for anyone that has worked in an emergency department, hospital wards, or an ICU, right, we all know the frustration when a false positive best practice advisory, some kind of notification comes up. And if you like informatics, you accept it. But if you're not quite sold on this, you lose a lot of faith. And so with that background of kind of the model that we developed, we thought that this would be a great way to kind of build off, some of the concepts that we previously published. And so some of the things that, we put this piece in critical care medicine about how we could use sepsis analytics to kind of move forward as a case study. And I think at least and I'm assuming this group probably agrees with this, that when it comes with some of these predictive models, particularly using deep learning, that the generalizability becomes of utmost importance. Implementation science, which is something that I think is oftentimes underappreciated, can have tremendous buy-in from the end users. And obviously something here, right, why we're speaking about this is the prospective implementation of these models and how they can actually be used to improve patient-centered outcomes and to test to see how they do. And we're not going to talk too much about governance. I think that's probably a separate group that would do a fantastic job jumping over that. So with this, I'm going to let Dr. Nemati speak for a little bit.
Yeah, so maybe I say a few words about the infrastructure that allowed us to deploy this system into clinical practice. We have a very supportive healthcare IS team at UC San Diego, but every time we approach them for implementation of AI system, the first question we get is, who is going to maintain this system? If you get hit by boss tomorrow, or if you decide to leave your institution, who is going to maintain this system? And then who is the customer service support? If the system goes down overnight, who can we call? So I had a very, very talented PhD student, Dr. Aaron Busina, who recently actually joined us as a faculty at the Department of Biomedical Informatics at UC San Diego. Aaron joined us with 8 years of industry experience around 2021. And so we worked with him very closely to build a HIPAA-compliant, scalable, fault-tolerant system on AWS. So the way the system works, the moment a patient walks into one of our hospitals, what is called the HL7AT message gets transmitted, which we receive in our HIPAA-compliant AWS environment. So we know that a new patient has arrived. At that point, we make FHIR calls to our electronic health record to get all the historical data from the patient. And from that point onward, every single measurements, including vitals, laboratory, any type of medications, we receive all of that data in our HIPAA-compliant AWS environment. We have our algorithm running in that environment. We make the calculations, and then we send the information back into electronic health record through what is called the HL7 incoming device data. This is the same mechanism that bedside manufacturers such as Philips and GE sends information to electronic health record. So this particular system is built on multiple services that allows the system to be fault tolerant, including redundant databases, including redundant virtual machines. So if one of the virtual machines goes down, it brought back up so that the system has a 99.999% uptime. In addition to that, every component of this system is monitored. Some of my engineers, they actually carry pagers with themselves. It's called pager duty. And if a component of system goes down for whatever reason, we get notified. There has been actually instances where Epic went down for whatever reason, and my team knew about that about half an hour to an hour before our own IT team, because we are receiving real-time alerts. So by building this system, putting in place, it allowed us to convince our IT team that this is actually production grade and it's something that they can rely on. Back to you, Gabe.
All right. Well, thank you for that detailed explanation. I know this is something that a lot of people have asked about. So anyway, we're going to talk about what we did. to kind of bring this, the composer model to the bedside using the infrastructure that you just heard about. And so, like I said, the model we used was called Composer. What we wanted to do is make sure we had a robust implementation strategy. And so we partnered up with our implementation scientists at UC San Diego. We told them what we were doing. They recommended the EPIS framework that we'll talk about shortly. We built up a really strong interdisciplinary team. We brought the model to the bedside, and then we kind of took the deep breath and said, yikes, I hope this works. Because otherwise we're going to have some very upset bosses that have just put a lot of emphasis and a lot of trust in us to do something we hadn't done yet at UC San Diego. So the EPIS framework is what we jumped in with. And I think what we really wanted to do here was first identify a clear use case for this predictive model. And really what we wanted to look at is recognizing that in an emergency department, if someone comes in obviously septic, febrile, hypotensive, tachycardic, you don't need a deep learning model to do that, right? You could probably have a first-year medical student or nursing student say, I think that person's probably septic. And that's something that everyone identifies very, very clearly. But what we've seen is that oftentimes when there's diagnostic uncertainty, people might not know what's going on up front. And they might delay antibiotics, and they might not order the right workup to start. And that was the use case that we really wanted to kind of focus on. Of course, we wanted to make sure that we had buy-in from all the appropriate leadership at our institution. And fortunately, we have an extremely supportive person in Dr. Chris Longhurst, who's really kind of been the backbone of making sure that barriers were taken down. And then as we started implementing this, we started realizing we had some good results. And I think where we're at right now is the sustainment phase that I think might be one of the more challenging ones, particularly in an era of significant nursing turnover. So what did we want to do? Well, we wanted to assess the impact of a deep learning model, Composer, on the early prediction of sepsis and see what patient outcomes happened after we started using this. The exposure we had was a nurse-facing best practice advisory that was triggered by Composer. And really, the hypothesis that we had was to see first that this is feasible to implement in real time, and that earlier recognition of these patients would result in improved patient outcomes. So the study design that we had was a pre-post quasi-experimental study in the emergency departments at UC San Diego Health. We have two. We did not feel that a randomized study at this point would make sense, particularly because of concerns of contamination of the study group, meaning that if they knew that one day the alert was on, one day the alert was off, or for different patients it was off and on, there might be some ambiguity about how people approached it. But what we did know is that we see a lot of sepsis at UC San Diego, and we took advantage of that. And in the study, we had about over 6,000 patients. And at Shamim's request, we used something called causal impact analysis to assess the impact of exposure. And if you haven't heard of causal impact analysis yet, it's something that companies like Google use to see how a change in advertisement actually impacts the change in revenue and things like that. So we felt that was probably going to be the most sophisticated way to assess if there was actually a difference in outcome. And we went bold here. Our primary outcome was mortality that we defined as both 28-day mortality or transition to hospice, looking with secondary outcomes of things like bundle compliance, organ failure, and 72-hour change in organ failure. So who did we include? Well, we took a look at all patients that came to our emergency department that met sepsis 3 criteria. This is the latest international definition of sepsis. I think Dr. Vinny Liu was actually on the guidelines for it. But all patients who met sepsis within 12 hours of ED arrival were included that were 18 years or older. And with that, we excluded those who developed 12 hours after presenting to the emergency department, those who were either discharged from the emergency department or died in the ED, and those who already had a sepsis bundle instituted prior to the nurse responding to the best practice advisory. And just to show you some of the baseline characteristics of what we have, like I said, we had about 6,000 or just over 6,000 patients. In the pre-intervention group, that's where we had about 5,000, and the post-intervention group was about 5 months, starting after December 2nd or December 7th, 2022. Overall, the groups were relatively well matched in the pre and post intervention groups. Here's the best practice advisory that we developed. This was, a lot of nursing input into what they thought would be useful here. We were also the first group at UCSD that was able to put a little secure chat in the best practice advisory. As you can see, I wanted to know about all of these, so it was requested that I get a notification too. These are the reasons that we gave our nurses when this came up. And again, a lot of this was kind of the work with them at the bedside, as well as recommendations from some of our IT teams about what would be an effective strategy here. So how did we analyze this? Well, again, nothing, I don't think there's any surprises here, right? Using the right statistical test to kind of take a look at differences in the pre and post interventions. And again, using causal impact analysis to really kind of take a look using a Bayesian structural time series model to see how mortality was impacted by the implementation of our model, adjusting for key confounders like severity of illness, ED volume, seasonal variations too. So how did we do in terms of things? Well, one thing that we first started seeing was that our BPA was not ignored that much by people. Less than about 5% or so of people really kind of, did the dreaded, let me get out of this immediately. And over 50% of people, of our nurses, actually notified their physician that was taking care of the patient, which is something that we were really, really excited about because one of the initial concerns that I had was that people would just kind of click something and get out of this. All right, in terms of the outcomes, and again, this is what got us really excited, is that we were able to see about a 1.9% absolute decrease or a 17% relative decrease in mortality after implementation of the model based on what was expected to what we actually found. You can also see here, in terms when we start talking about why we might have seen these outcomes, we saw about a 5.9% absolute increase in our sepsis bundle compliance, which is about a 10% relative increase, suggesting, right, that some of the things that we wanted our providers to do were being accomplished after notification. We also saw that when the nurses transmitted the alert to the physicians, that we had a significant decrease in time to antibiotics. And again, there's much controversy over the ideal management of sepsis, but I think everyone agrees that for patients that are septic, that prompt and appropriate antibiotics always makes sense. We also saw some other things suggesting that there was benefit, and particularly saw a decrease in SOFA scores at 72 hours that was significant. And we even saw a trend towards a decrease in ICU admissions and ICU length of stay, although not significant. Something that we just put out in critical care explorations was provide our nursing perceptions of our system. We had about 120 or so nurses, physicians, and APPs that responded. And on average, about 80% of people either had favorable or neutral comments or thoughts about our model. We also felt, we found out that our nurses tended to have a lot more benefit there. And one thing that on the implementation side is we certainly have seen, and I think this is probably a trend, is that tools like this are much more, the younger generation adopts these tools and finds a little bit more benefit than some of our senior physicians and senior nurses that just, felt that they already knew everything that was going on with the patients. So moving forward, I think we're going to talk a little bit here, and I'll let Dr. Nemati take over right now about some of the exciting things that we've been trialing here at UC San Diego.
Thank you, Gabe. So we have been incredibly lucky at UC San Diego to have really engaged physicians. And after we deployed the system in December of 2022, we have been performing regular chart reviews in order to assess reasons for algorithm false alarms. And one of the key reasons has been what is called the sepsis mimics. This should be very familiar to the physicians on this call. Often patient shows up in the emergency department with GI hemorrhage or is a cirrhotic patients, and the sepsis alert goes off. The reason behind that being that from a perspective of just vital signs and labs, there is overlap in septic syndrome and some of these other conditions. So if you go to next slide, we decided to actually build a system that leverages clinical notes on these patients to do a deeper dive on a subset of patients to see if we can eliminate some of these false alarms. So the system that we built, and we just last month we published in Nature Digital Medicine, essentially makes use of structured data to make predictions about sepsis. And then for patients who are somewhere around the what we call borderline patients, risk scores of 50% to 75%, that's where the diagnostic uncertainty is the highest and the positive predictive value is the lowest. For those patients, we do a deep dive into their clinical notes using large language models. We perform differential diagnosis, and then we send the alert only if sepsis is among the top 5 differential diagnoses of these patients. So by implementing this system at UC San Diego, we have been able to significantly reduce false alarms. Next slide. So this table from our publication demonstrates that the original composer model had a positive predictive value of about 22%. After implementation of the large language model, we were able to see a significant increase in positive predictive value. We were also able to maintain, so going up to about 52.9%, we were able to also maintain the same sensitivity. And the way we achieved that was essentially with the original composer model had a risk score threshold of 60%. We managed to lower the threshold to 50%. Typically, if you do that, that results in increase in false alarms. Yes, your sensitivity increases, but also you are going to have additional false alarms. But because we deployed the large language model for any score between 50% and 75%, we managed to maintain similar level of sensitivity, but at the same time, not have additional false alarm and get much better positive predictive value. And next. So we also considered running this algorithm sort of as a biomarker. The idea here is that at the time that the physicians, they have the clinical suspicion of infection. The question was if at that point in time, they look at this lab, so that particular patient population is now enriched. The underlying prevalence of sepsis is going to be higher. We observed that the PPV of the composer LLM is as high as 80%, showing that the algorithm can be quite actionable at that point in time. Next slide. So we also did every time we run a new algorithm, we make sure to perform chart reviews with our clinicians. The reason being that sepsis is an area where our gold standard labels, whether it is based on the sepsis 3 criteria or the CMS criteria, themselves are noisy. So we have been relying on our clinical team to perform chart reviews to come up with a gold standard. And it turns out that once we did chart review, it turns out even among our false alarms, the majority of those patients, they had bacterial infection, and therefore they could have benefited from antibiotics. Similarly, when we look at our false positives, when we perform the differential diagnosis, it turns out the true diagnosis of the patient is often within the top 5 differential of the patient. And this has implications for these notions of anchoring bias and automation bias. Anchoring bias occurs when you have a non-septic patient, but you are sending alerts saying that the patient is septic, and the physician might go down that diagnostic pathway and they might ignore other situations, and that might put patient at risk. Similarly, with automation bias, that's when the patient might be septic, but if the algorithm doesn't fire and the physician is relying on the firing of the algorithm, that case of sepsis might be a miss and treatment might be delayed. So we believe that by approaching this sort of differential diagnosis approach, we can address both of these sort of cognitive biases. More broadly, we have been doing a lot of sort of thinking around the reasons behind false alarms of this type of systems. I like this figure because it says essentially that we all are hoping for early prediction, but in practice, data that is required for making predictions is often delayed because it's the physicians, it's the clinicians, providers who order diagnostic tests that then get ingested by AI systems. So in practice, what we end up with is delayed predictions. And then by the time we have the intermediate diagnosis, in the case of sepsis, some of these patients, they have already develop organ failure. So we have been working on ways to get ahead of the curve, get the AI system actually involved in ordering diagnostic tests. We have a study ongoing at UC San Diego where in a subset of patients that are high risk, we order lactate test. The second category is, what we just talked about, is when there are potential explanations for observed sudden septums that have nothing to do with sepsis itself, and it's potentially the sepsis mimics. And lastly, one of the key reasons behind false alarms is the type of measurements that we make. They may not provide deep enough system level mechanism information about what is going on with the patient. So with that being said, next slide. So we have implemented the system at UC San Diego where we are kind of at the very top level making predictions about sepsis, but then we go down the diagnostic pathway, assessing serious criteria, evidence of organ failure criteria. And if the algorithm is saying that this patient is likely to become septic, but the serious criteria is not met yet, but it's because there is missingness, we are now sending orders for nursing assessments. Similarly, for organ failure, if there is, the algorithm is above the threshold, but there is significant missingness of laboratory values, we are now sending orders for lactate to the EHR. And we believe that by doing this approach, we can get ahead of the curve and have actual predictive models. Next slide. Yeah, so the other way to approach this is by augmenting this type of predictive models using more continuous sensors, continuous measurements. Dr. Wardi has a study ongoing. He has been recruiting patients, giving them Fitbit. That's in the context of prediction of readmission. We have another study we are just kickstarting looking at this microneedle sensors for lactate measurements, try to get more continuous measurements so that we don't have to wait for physicians to order those labs. Next slide. Yes, and with that, the way we have been thinking about this, so far, many of the solutions in this domain, they have been point solutions, but it often helps to think about the entire continuum of care, starting from the point that patients arrive in the emergency department, having timely data to make predictions. And then at that point in time, we can also make predictions about, organ failure. One of my talented postdoc students who might be on this call, Dr. Ben Gross, he's now looking at risk stratifying patients according to the risk of not only infection, but also shock. And he has a paper that should show up in critical care medicine shortly that basically shows that he's able to risk stratify patients in real time so that patients at the highest risk level, they can receive antibiotics in a timely fashion. Next. Yeah, so I think, again, one of the key issues this field has been dealing with is the issue of missing data. We have been testing a number of different strategies. I mentioned already continuous data, but we also have other methods such as we recently developed the app that it's the back end of this app is a large language model that interacts with the patient while they are sitting in the emergency department and asking them questions about their signs and symptoms, and then provides a draft HMP essentially that gets sent to the composer model so that as soon as the first set of vitals and labs are available, now you also have some clinical notes essentially to work with to make predictions and at the same time reduce false alarms. Dr. Wardi has a study right now where he's ordering diagnostic tests such as trivalent test by informatics in order to get additional insight into whether the patient has bacterial versus viral infection. So we are really talking about enriching the data, having more timely data so we can have more accurate predictions.
Great, guys. Thank you. Some super intriguing data and methods and integration. Really exciting. So I'm going to turn it over now to our discussant, Dr. Tarbici. Maybe 10 minutes of your thoughts and comments on what you've heard.
I didn't realize we were going to do thoughts and comments, but yeah, I'm happy to. So obviously, thank you both. Really fascinating work. I like the fact that you've covered several aspects of the field, with an emphasis on implementation, CDS, how you're pruning the kind of the cohort so that you can make a reasonable prediction, right? I think that's actually really compelling and one of the major issues I think we're facing with these. I'm just gonna go into conversation, I think, because it's interesting. And a lot of questions have already come up that I think we can talk about for a while. Let me channel a little bit of my thoughts on some of the questions coming in. So from a research and investigative perspective, let's talk a little bit about kind of the implications, regulatory compliance of doing this kind of work. And what do you need to do at a systems level and kind of how do you navigate that, especially as we talk a little bit more about equipoise in the space? Like, how do you navigate that territory? Is it quality? Is it research? How do you make a case for this? And what do you tell your patients and your compliance and IRB folks? That's like 7 questions in one, but start where you would like.
Shamim, do you want to jump on that first, or let me?
Well, some of the earlier work in this domain with respect to algorithm developments, they were all done as IRB studies. We are blessed to have a HIPAA compliant AWS environment at UC San Diego, and we are able to do a lot of our development computations in that environment. When it came to implementation, I think Dr. Wardi can provide more insight. Unfortunately, it's somewhat difficult to do some of these studies through IRB process, and doing them as quality improvement seems to be more effective. And Gabe, he can comment about that.
Yeah, I can jump in right there. So, I think this is something that every institution faces, right? Is what's the difference between quality improvement and what's the difference between research? And so at least, here at UC San Diego, we're fortunate enough to work under the auspices of a group that, kind of goes through, that's called the Acquire Committee, that judges if something is quality improvement. It has members of our IRB present. And if they determine that it's quality improvement, like they felt it was for this model with the implementation, then that's the approach that we went for kind of implementing this. I also know that, I think I spoke with you probably about 4 years ago, Dr. Jarovici, on the phone about how you guys implemented did your randomized study using the EPIC sepsis model. And I think you had a similar approach. We're kind of, again, going through on the quality side. And as I recall, right, your study, I believe, did have quality in the name itself. And again, that's how we approached it, because I do think that a lot of these things, right, this is about making sure that patients get something that's considered standard of care, not just at UC San Diego Health, but also there's a national quality metric that really backs up kind of, what we were trying to get people to do. So that's at least how we approached it. And again, I know that every institution is different, but I think the quality side, particularly for things where you are looking to improve quality and sometimes you want to make rapid changes, that it's a very viable. And if your institution believes in it and you have institutional review board presence for that designation, I think by all means, that's far and away the best way to do this.
Yeah. And it's a tough space. We also, thank you for the shout out. We navigated it with strong leadership, right, under quality. So that was essential. And there are a couple of, I know NYU's got a really strong framework for this that we leveraged. There are a couple of things you need to have in place when you're thinking about kind of splitting a population, especially if you're doing a randomized study. So I'd say it boils down to, how close is this to standard care? Is it really research, right? From an equipoise perspective, who are you testing here? And the other one, is it really a limited resource, right? So if you're like, I have a sepsis response team and they can only service one area of the hospital, then I'm going to randomly pick an area of the hospital, for instance, randomly pick a subset of the population. And I think that's where you can make a case for randomization. And I think that's always where people get stuck. So I understand in your circumstances, right? Pre-post with causal analysis. Before I go into a little bit of the outcomes that you guys had, there are questions about patient confidentiality. And I think you addressed that by referencing your HIPAA compliant cloud architecture. Okay. Consent. What about the notion of consent in this context? Patient consent for, an AI system, let alone potentially research.
Yeah, so we did not get patient consent for this. Again, part of this is going through our quality improvement board that I mentioned earlier, the acquire committee that was set up. This is one of these things where consent, ultimately patients are going to be the ultimate stakeholder in a lot of these AI models. But for something like this, the feasibility drops to zero almost. To have something going like this. And again, I think you summarized very, very well. For quality improvement, if that's truly what you're doing, which is what we did here, that I think that should be exempt from getting consent. Once you start getting in, like you mentioned, right? If there is true equipoise, then that's where it becomes a much more slippery slope. And I think that's where, even myself, as someone that's very bullish on bringing a lot of these models to the bedside, would probably take a step back and at least, kind of discuss that with patients, or at least the people, the end users that are receiving this. I don't know if you have any other comments on that, Shamim, or anyone else in the chat.
Yeah, we have ongoing studies where we are serving different stakeholders. We just recently received a grant from University of California Office of the President across multiple UC campuses. And the first step of that study is to engage different stakeholders and including patients, IT teams in the hospital, providers, administrators, trying to assess their sort of sentiments and attitudes towards AI. Having said that, this type of systems are not meant to replace the standard of care. They are providing second pair of eyes, and also in answering some of the questions in the chat box about misdiagnosis, etc. These systems are again supposed to augment care, and they are not meant to be used for diagnosis or treatment of patients.
Yeah, right on. Let's talk a little bit about your outcomes. So through your analysis, you saw a pretty substantial improvement in mortality, right? I don't know if you want to go back to that slide, but how do we know in a pre-post analysis? I guess unpack that a little bit. How can we attribute the intervention singularly? Maybe explain the statistical approach for us so we can get to understand 2% absolute decrease in mortality is huge, right? So is it the singular impact of this best practice advisory? Are there other factors to consider in this implementation that may have contributed to that success?
Well, I can at least, or Shamil, I'll let you talk. I know that you
Yeah, let
were
me talk about the statistics a little bit, and then I pass it to you, Gabe, to talk about the actual patient outcomes.
All right.
So one of the maybe underappreciated aspects of this causal impact analysis, which is buried somewhere in the appendix of our publication, is that essentially you are trying to predict in advance the mortality of the patients at the population level. And that's what the dashed line here is. And in order to do that, you're adjusting for a number of different confounders, including patient case mix, the ED volume, seasonality, many different factors. And then you observe the actual mortality. That's the solid line. So the difference between the two of them is what is called the residual, whatever remains at the end. And so what Google and these big companies, they do is they carefully examine the residuals to see if the residuals, they resemble essentially uncorrelated white noise, or there is still some remaining patterns in the residuals. Once we did that analysis, it turns out that our residuals, and that all of that information is in the appendix of the paper, came out as white noise, meaning that potentially no other factors could have explained their drop in mortality that we looked at. And some of this statistical analysis, is the reason that these big companies like Google, they make billion-dollar type of decisions, and the people who go to Google for doing advertisement. So to that extent, we were confident by looking at those diagnostic tests that that the patterns are real. Having said that, what caused the drop in mortality? I'm sure there is some component of also Hawthorne effect involved, but we think about Hawthorne effect as something negative. But if you can sustain it over time, it's actually something positive. We should be all happy about reducing mortality.
I don't disagree. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just at least, on the clinical side, when we were doing this, we did not have any other interventions that were implemented, right? This was the only quality improvement initiative that was going on while this was occurring. But you bring up a fair point, right? Ideally, in a perfect world, this would be a randomized controlled trial. It's just so difficult, particularly with such a small, a relatively small number of sites, sites, so to speak, to actually do that with great methodology. And it's looking at some of the attendees here, right? The Kaiser team in Northern California, I think, has done a fantastic job with either deterioration or some of their other approaches, right, of taking full advantage of these large health systems to do a true, randomized study about how these models can impact care. So if someone's going to tell me saying, hey, you didn't do an RCT, I'm going to push back on your results. I think it's a fair criticism. We listed that in the limitations too. But I think we probably did the next best thing by using some pretty sophisticated statistical approaches as Shamim said, right, really kind of get at the heart of, how the difference between this intervention could be explained by.
Let me make two quick comments about the question in the chat box about the changes in physician behavior. The number one is well, this BPA was a nurse facing BPA, and the data that Gabe presented earlier, one of their key findings was when we looked at the nursing actions, whenever the nurses they selected will notify physician immediately, there was a drop in time to antibiotics. So that's the multivariate logistic regression analysis that we did, and we proposed that as the mechanism for dropping mortality, the reduction in time antibiotics. And then the second part, unpublished work, but once we deployed the large language model, we noticed that in our original work, roughly about 20-25% of the time, the nurses, they were selecting no infection suspected. Once we deployed the large language model, we have been keeping track of the nursing actions, their selection of BPA, and that number now has gone down to 5%. And the reason is the large language model does a deep dive into clinical notes and tries to make an assessment for infection or any likelihood that the patient was predisposed to having infection. And so we can look at all the statistical numbers, but it's always nice to look at actually the end user's behavior and see how implementation and upgrading the system has influenced the end user's behavior.
And just one other thing to note on that, I know Dr. Tarabici, you targeted pharmacists for the sepsis study that you did. The reason we chose nurses in our emergency department is just it's very practical. Oftentimes physicians in the ED will be carrying up 16, 20 patients at once, and for them to have that the patient's chart up in Epic when the alert will go off in a timely fashion is sometimes very, very unlikely. So our nurses have a much smaller ratio. And they honestly, at least the experience I've had, is they tended to be a lot more receptive to getting this, particularly with some of the implementation surveys that we sent out. Was oftentimes, attending physicians with at least 5 years since they finished their training that, said, I'm not quite sure I buy all this stuff. So
I have a lot I would love to talk about the informatics aspects, the clinical decision support, the implementation science, but I definitely want to have people's questions in the chat answered. So I'm going to pivot and we're going to get back to some of the CDS concepts. And I'm going to go back to, so Chris says, and I'm just going to point this out, owning the uptime for the system. I mean, solid move, right? I mean, that's a core expectation. It's something that folks in a classic academic setting don't always do, right? Having a sustainability plan to your implementation, huge, and you probably got a lot of kudos from the IS staff on that one. Another question, we talked about the other questions. So, this is from Anusha. So this is a little more technical. Hopefully I can frame it correctly. So how do you define data on conformance with respect to the training samples during inference from Composer? Oof.
Yeah, that's part of our 2021 paper. Essentially, what we did was during the training, we kept track of the examples, the patients that the system made correct predictions on. And then during the inference time, we basically ask the question, is this new patient that is coming in, is it similar to the patients in our training set that we observed? And if the new patient was an outlier, essentially, was not similar, we refrained from making any predictions. We tag them as indeterminate. And then the question is, at that point, is why this patient is indeterminate? Is it because it's a patient that we have never seen before? Is it because this patient has a lot of missingness or outliers in their data? And so more recently, we managed to essentially build a neural network that accepts all of these inputs and tells us, what is the likely reason for this patient being an outlier patient, or the input data for this patient being an outlier input.
Anisha, if you want to add any follow-ups, you're welcome to. You came on camera, so.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for answering my question. I was just curious to know because it's EHR, we all know how data can be, right? It can be messy, it can be there's a lot of missingness when you talk about real-time data. So I was just curious at inference, how do you just trust the model to just screen out patients that might be vital?
Yeah, honestly, at the end of the day, it's a combination of some rule-based system and then some advanced statistics. So the rule-based system, we do make sure that there is at least one vital or one lab is available. We have systems in place that looks at the statistics, the upper bound, lower bound of all of these labs. And then when it comes to the actual statistical methods, the method that we published on in 2021 is called conformal prediction. So again, this notion that you have what we call a trust set is a set of examples from the training that the algorithm performed well, and during the test time, we make a comparison, and if you are considered an outlier, then we refrain from making predictions.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, I'm gonna maybe take a couple of steps back here as we wrap up. So obviously, I would say, randomized or not, what you guys have done is shown how this tool can be useful in your organization and in your setting. And if anything, actually, you've made the case that would be unethical, frankly, to run a randomized control study at your organization after you found your results. And I am opening up the floor for this conversation. Feel free to chime in, anybody on this call. But that would be my take. If I were an IRB, I'd say, wait, you did a robust thing and you showed it saved lives. It would not be wise to randomize. So taking a step back from that, where are we at as a community? And I'll just focus on sepsis in terms of what kind of work needs to be done to scale these solutions. Do we need more studies? Have we reached a level of, I guess, comfort with general predictive algorithms for sepsis, as mushy as the condition can be, that with enough data that shows a CDS system driven by some kind of a prediction, a reasonable prediction, is associated with improved outcomes? Obviously, local circumstances are important and those considerations prevail. So who's getting it, what you're doing with it, what the expectation is, obviously that's a very local environment thing. But just from a broader equipoise perspective, first question, do we need more studies? Or do we need localization? I mean, what is the extent of the evidence that we need to build within an individual organization? And I'm thinking about others now, like how do we replicate this work? Mark wants a meta-analysis. I think that's cool. We can do that too.
Maybe I'll make a comment here. I think between the prelim, or I'm not sure how to call the data that you produced from Metro Health, which showed a reduction in secondary outcomes and what was it, days alive and outside the hospital. I don't know if there was a mortality percentage associated with that. The data here, data from groups including Mark,
Yep.
others, Suchi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would say all of those implementations, all those algorithms are different. Each of them, none of them is perfect. Like maybe the thing we would think of as a new medication for Alzheimer's or like the definitive evidence. I don't think we're going to get there for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
I think the accumulated evidence suggests that the pairing of an algorithmic approach, um, and in some cases, Epic's tool, which we know has its warts and challenges, they're in
Yeah.
V2, as well as sophisticated statistical approaches that we've seen here, which are very cool, trying to drive down PPV, which we know is going to be essential for sustainability. No matter where you land on that spectrum, the pairing of that algorithm with careful QI/PI processes has been shown repeatedly to improve mortality, improve bundle compliance. And I think at this point, spending a lot more time on evaluation frameworks to generate that evidence is probably not going to yield the community much at all. That's my take. I know it doesn't reach kind of the level of quality of evidence that we like to see, but I do think it meets a certain best practice standard. The question you raised about whether it is now flipped the script about can you effectively run sepsis and mortality mitigation without an algorithmic approach? That may be more of a little bit of the open question right now. And
Yeah.
even if that algorithm approach is driving what Shamim said, which is a Hawthorne effect, which is enhanced scrutiny, which is service line agreements about approaches and timeliness for care. Um, at some point, we can't disconnect the two, right? Because a beautiful algorithm with no implementation arm is going to fail. And a crappy algorithm or a moderate algorithm with a beautiful implementation arm is probably going to succeed.
I, that was beautiful, beautifully said, and I agree entirely. And I think any study really is more about the factors that contribute to the improvement in the mortality. I have a lightning round question about clinical decision support. So as an informaticist, I feel like it really ought to be useful to the end user. And is screening sepsis all the time where we're going to land? What is the next iteration of that? I have my own biases, but I'll let you guys answer there. Gabe or Shamim, feel free. I mean, what's the next iteration for a sepsis CDS other than screaming someone's at risk for sepsis? You've talked a little bit about differentials and how that factors in upstream. The question is, what is really the next best thing that you expect from a user that's actionable, other than I'm going to do a thing? Thank you very much.
Well, I'll let Dr. Wardi to talk about that because he's looking at biomarkers, and also on the other side, he's looking at SEP1 bundle.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, right? It depends on, obviously, right? You want to make sure that your predictive model does well, right? So that's what we're tinkering with right now, right? Is multimodal data. You heard some of the work about, using large language models, how that improves it. Biomarkers, I think, are something very exciting too, right? If there is, some diagnostic, the model is, a moderate, say, hey, this could be sepsis, right? What's the added value? Is that going to be too expensive? Is that something that people are not going to be excited about? But I think a lot of it is going to be driven, right, by what your own institution is going to find value added. So for us at UCSD, right, obviously mortality is a huge thing. I think everyone agrees with that. Something else that we're focusing on, trying to augment our predictive abilities with some models, are going to be things like unplanned 30-day readmissions in sepsis patients and beyond. We're experimenting now, right, with setting up something to set up some deterioration. Predictive models fitting with that, right? As sepsis is kind of a subgroup for that. So I think there's, as the science is getting better and better, I think we're very well equipped, right, to kind of optimize all these different components along the chain, so to speak, of making sure there's value added at the end of the day and patients are doing better. But again, I think a lot is going to be very heavily dependent on what your institution wants and what they're going to give you to do this. Because I think everyone here agrees, right? In a perfect world, you have infinite resources, but getting those resources sometimes can be one of the biggest hurdles to kind of jump through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Local circumstances prevail. We're done, Vinny. I know.
Yeah, with that, thank you guys. Great discussion, beautiful presentation. Thanks to all who joined, and thanks for your time.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.